So, today I will discuss the topic a radio format or a programming format. It describes the overall content broadcast on a radio station. The radio format emerged mainly in the US in the 1950s at a time when radio was compelled to develop new and exclusive way to programming by competition with television. The formula has since spread as a reference for commercial radio programming worldwide. A radio format aims to reach a more or less specific audience according to certain type of programming, which can be thematic or general, more informative or more musical, among other possibilities. Radio formats are often used as a marketing tool and are subject to frequent changes. Except for talk radio or sports radio formats, most programming formats are based on commercial music. So, here are so many formats which are very popular, and the best part is that there is variety in the programs so that the listeners don't feel monotonous. Even before Second World War, radio stations in North America and Europe almost always adopted a journalist radio format. However, the US witnessed the growing strengthening of television over the radio as the major mass media in the country by the late 1940s. American television had more financial resources to produce journalist programs that provoked the migration of countless talents from radio network to the new medium. Under this context, the radio was pressured to seek alternatives to maintain its audience and cultural relevance. As a consequence, AM radio stations began to emerge in the US and Canada, many of which independents, that is, not affiliated with the network, developed a format which targeted audience with programming consisted of music, news, charismatic DJs or RJs to directly attract a certain audience. By the mid 1960s, American FM radio's penetration began achieving balance with AM radio since Federal Communication Commission required the co-owned AM and FM stations to be programmed independently independently from each other. This resulted in huge competition between radio stations in the AM and FM spectrum to differentiate themselves for both audience and advertisers. At that time, it proliferated many radio formats which included presentation, schedule, and target audience as well as reporters. During the 1970s and 1980s, radio programming formats expanded into commercially successful variations, for example, album oriented rock and urban contemporary, among others, which spread to the most AM and FM radio stations in the US. So, now I will discuss radio formats, which are that formats that are very popular nowadays and since the commencement of radio. First format I will discuss that is radio podcast. Radio podcast, or we can call it only podcast. A podcast is a digital audio. or video file series that is typically episodic and available for download or streaming on the internet. The term podcast is a combination of the words iPod and broadcast, reflecting its origin as a medium for distributing audio content. Podcasts cover a wide range of topics and genres, including news, entertainment, education, storytelling, true crime, sports, technology, business, and more. They are created by individuals, organizations, media outlets, and content creators who produce regular episodes that listeners can subscribe to and access on demand. Podcasts provide a flexible and convenient way for people to consume audio or video content whenever and wherever they choose. Listeners can use podcasting platforms or apps to subscribe to their favorite shows, receive automatic updates when new episodes are released, and listen or watch at their own pace. Podcasts have gained significant popularity in recent years due to their accessibility, the ability to niche down into specific interest, and freedom for creators to produce content without traditional broadcasting restrictions. They offer a unique medium for storytelling, in depth discussions, interviews, and educational content, allowing listeners to engage with topics that resonate with them. Before going ahead, I would like to discuss the history of podcast, why it is called a podcast to begin with. Podcasts are a form of media content that was developed in 2004 when former MTV video jockey Adam Curry and software developer Dave Weiner coded the iPodder. The iPodder was a program that let a user download internet radio broadcast to their Apple iPod. This is where the term and meaning podcast was born, taking its name from a blend of iPod and broadcast. Today, podcasts are an extremely popular form of audio entertainment and have progressed beyond being downloadable radio shows. Each podcast is a series created by a host and then published episode by episode online, where subscribers can then download and listen to each episode when it's released. Unlike traditional methods of content production like TV and radio shows, podcasts are an accessible way for content creator to connect with an audience. They are not even currently regulated, meaning you don't need a broadcasting license to publish podcast content. Anyone with basic podcast equipment like a microphone, recording software, and a membership to a hosting platform can create their shows. Monetizing a podcast is also becoming a reliable way to make either a side or a full time income thanks to brand sponsorships, affiliate marketing, subscriptions, and paid content. We can take the example of an app that is Spotify. You can record your audio or you can record your podcast on that. Are podcast audio or video? This question arises many times. Actually, podcast started out as a completely audio medium. However, with the growing popularity of podcast, many podcasters have embraced video podcasting as a way to stand out and reach an even bigger audience. Video is extremely popular. In fact, users are averaging 19 hours per week watching online videos in 2022, which is almost 50% more from 2018. So, podcast creators who want their show to see the most growth and appeal to wider audience and adding video elements to their podcast. What is the purpose of a podcast? A podcast can have many purposes, but the main one is to entertain its audience. Listeners of podcast might have one of several reasons to subscribe to a podcast, such as to hear updates and breakdowns of current events, learn about a new topic or industry, laugh at co-host rife and jokes, listen it on interviews with popular or famous guests, experience an audio drama or narrative storytelling. But behind each of these reasons is desire to be entertained, whether listener want to learn something new or simply have something to take their mind off a mundane task. They want to enjoy the experience of listening to a podcast. If they don't enjoy it, they probably would not keep coming back. So, there are different types of podcasts with examples. Podcasts are as varied as people's imaginations can make them, and there are about as many genres as you can think of. There can be news and education, health and fitness, comedy, and even fiction podcasts are just a few of the most popular kinds. While the podcasting world is wide and varying and limited only by creators' imaginations, the vast majority of podcasts can be broken down into one of four formats, that is, conversational, narrative nonfiction, scripted fiction, repurposed content. Of course, these are loose categories, and some podcasts are mixed or hybrids of multiple formats. We will take a closer look at each main category along with popular examples. So, first of all, we will discuss narrative storytelling podcast. These podcasts present engaging stories, often with a serialized format. They can cover a wide range of genres, including true crime, fiction, personal narratives, and documentaries. And another format is interview based podcasts that focus on interviews feature in depth conversations with guests from various fields such as authors, experts, celebrities, and industry professionals. The conversations explore specific topics or provide insights into the guest's experiences and expertise. Educational and informative. Educational podcasts deliver informative content on specific subjects including science, history, technology, personal development, and language learning. They aim to provide in depth knowledge and insights to the listeners. Another is conversational comedic podcast. These podcasts involve light-hearted and humorous discussions between host or a group of host or RJ. They cover a wide range of topics including pop culture, current events, comedy sketches, and general banter. Basically, this most common podcast format is the actually conversational one, and these are in informal style with anywhere from solo host to a round table discussion. Many of these shows are interview podcasts, which are discussions between one or more host and their guest, usually diving deep into the guest's personal history or expert knowledge on a topic. Stuff You Should Know is a very popular example of conversational podcast. Hosts Chuck and Josh spend each episode educating each other about a topic of general interest. So, here, two hosts can discuss each other educational content, and through this they can educate their listeners. Their style is extremely informal, and listening to this feels like listening in on a chill conversation between two friends. Another is Another type of broadcast is news and analysis. Similar to radio news programs, podcasts also offer news updates, analysis, and commentary on various topics. They often provide a more in depth exploration of news stories, allowing for longer form discussions and investigations. Another type of format is hybrid format. Some podcasts combine different formats, blending storytelling, interviews, and discussions to create a unique listening experience. They may also incorporate elements of radio program formats such as music interludes and or audience engagement. One key distinction between radio programs and podcast is the on-demand nature of podcast. Podcasts are pre-recorded and made available for listeners to access at their convenience. While radio programs are broadcasted at specific times and require real time running in, it's important to note that these are general categorizations and there is wide variety of radio program formats and podcast genres available. Both radio and podcast offer diverse content options catering to different interests and preferences of the listeners. First format I will discuss that is podcast. Radio podcast, or we can call it only podcast. A podcast is a digital audio or video file series that is typically episodic and available for download or streaming on the internet. The term podcast is a combination of the words iPod and broadcast, reflecting its origin as a medium for distributing audio content. Podcasts cover a wide range of topics and genres, including news, entertainment, education, storytelling, true crime, sports, technology, business, and more. They are created by individuals, organizations, media outlets, and content creators who produce regular episodes that listeners can subscribe to and access on demand. So, today I will discuss. The topic, a radio format or a programming format. It describes the overall content broadcast on a radio station. The radio format emerged mainly in the US in the 1950s at a time when radio was compelled to develop new and exclusive way to programming by competition with television. The formula has since spread as a reference for commercial radio programming worldwide. A radio format aims to reach a more or less specific audience according to certain type of programming, which can be thematic or general, more informative or more musical, among other possibilities. Radio formats are often used as a marketing tool and are subject to frequent changes. Except for talk radio or sports radio formats, most programming formats are based on commercial. So, talk radio has played a significant role in shaping public opinion, promoting political discourse, and providing a platform for community engagement. It allows for the exploration of various perspectives, encourages critical thinking, and provides a space for individuals to voice over their concerns and opinions. With the advent of digital platforms, talk radio has expanded beyond traditional broadcast radio and can now be accessed through online streaming, podcast, and on demand platforms, allowing for greater accessibility and flexibility in consuming talk radio content. So, now I would like to discuss some points in details. First is interactiveness. The two most important subjective factors which make for recall are interest and attention. They are closely connected. If you are interested in something, you will pay attention to it. And if you listen to it carefully, you will remember it. So, the first thing the talker must do is to rouse the interest of the listener. If something concerns him, he will naturally become interested in it and will pay attention to it. But if it is of remote or merely academic interest, he will at best listen to it without closely following its argument. If a radio talk is on the functioning of the railways, the focus should be on safety aspect rather on a budgetary analysis. The radio talk is aimed at the listening public and therefore should center around points that will hold the listener's attention. Next point is clarity. Similarly, any material that is retained and remembered possesses certain characteristics. The listener perceives the talk as a whole or as a pattern, and in remembering it, also it is the pattern that comes to the mind. Experimental evidence shows that the listener tries to get hold of the pattern, the central theme of what is communicated in the talk. Psychologists have described this process, the process of reacting to given material, as an effort after meaning. We not only seek to find a meaning in what we perceive, we also recall more easily something which we have understood. The lesson for the talker is to ensure that there is certain central theme in what he says. A talk which is a series of disjointed observations will not be recalled. It will leave little impression on the listener. Psychologists have also drawn attention to a factor described as the dominant detail which facilitates recall. What is dominant detail? If you ask a friend the story of a film, the answer might be, oh, it is the eternal triangle, but this is not the whole story. The friend may add that it is the eternal triangle with a difference. This difference is what gives the clue to dominant detail. Thus, while human beings attempt to perceive objects as a unitary wholes, there is some detail which stands out apart from the rest and influences what is perceived. The dominant detail is a kind of nucleus around which the other images cluster in a process of recall. It sets the stage for remembering. Take the well known film Earth. It is the eternal triangle, but right through we see the heroine trying to forge a little life of her own. This movement towards the woman's self identity is dominant detail. Another point is intensity. Do not burden your script with details which in case make little impression and which are easily forgotten. Chief among these are figures. When they get into lakhs and crores, they mean nothing to the common person. It is much better to give comparisons. For example, if you want to say that the population of Australia is very small, it would be more revealing to say the total population of India is only equal to the number of children born in India in just 1 year. If you must give figures, give round figures. Also, easily forgotten are names, especially unfamiliar names like those in a Russian novel, where additionally you discover that characters have several names. You have a face a similar problem if required to discuss a border dispute between our country and China. Sometimes one town may have three names: an Indian name, a Tibetan name, and a Chinese name. A wise talker who is anxious to communicate will choose one name, the one that is least unfamiliar to the audience. The person who is concerned to show off his learning will use all the three. The former will succeed as a radio talker while the latter may not. So now I will be discussing techniques of radio talk. What are the techniques of radio talk? Clarity, informality, self-explanatory. How is the talker to meet the special requirements of radio talk? Let us discuss each requirement and see what it demands. Of course, these requirements are interrelated, and if you satisfy one, you may also be satisfying or more of the others at the same time. First technique is clarity. We have discussed clarity, which helps the listeners to recall dominant details of the talk after a certain lapse of time. It is commonly agreed that unlike the written articles, the radio talk is heard, it is not read. Therefore, the meaning of each sentence must be clear when heard only once. You cannot listen to it second time to unravel the meaning. In the case of printed article, if you do not get the intention of the author on the reading it once, you can reread the article or parts of it which you find obscure. But this is not possible in the case of radio talk. So the first principle of writing a radio talk to make each sentence transparently clear. This can be achieved in the following ways. Sentences should be short. A good rule to follow is to keep the sentences down to about 3 lines each. Long sentences frequently involve qualifying clauses. You can simplify them by putting the qualifying clauses in the separate sentences. Sentences in the active voice tend to make for easier comprehension than those in indirect speech in the passive voice. For instance, it is better to say several distinguished economists believe that a huge budgetary deficit tends to result in inflation, rather than to say the view that a huge deficit in the budget will tend to result in inflation is held by. Another technique is informality. There is an important respect in which a radio talk differs from a public speech or lecture. A speech or lecture is heard or listened to by a collective audience or group, In this case of radio talk, however, it is the individual, a few family members, perhaps a case of the radio talk. However, it is the individual, few family members, perhaps a friend or two who constitute the audience. The radio talker speaks to them, thousands of such small groups in the intimacy of their homes. The radio talk is like a conversation with friends. It is informal, it is chatty. True, the other party, the listeners, cannot but it. They cannot interject. It is the talker's job to do that for them by raising questions and doubt on their behalf and trying to answer them. The successful talker will attempt to do so. Next is self explanatory. The talker is not face to face with his audience. This in another point of difference between the radio talk and the public speech or lecture. In the later two cases, the speaker faces his audience. The talker does not have this advantage and so has problems. Facial expressions communicate a great deal. The audience can see from the hint of a smile on speaker's face that he is making a mild joke and that he is saying sometimes tongue in cheek. Again, on the other hand, one can see from his expression that he is serious about the point he is making. Such visuals aids are not available for a radio talk, so the talker has to make up for them in the way or he or she reads the script. Reading out script is rather like speaking lines in a play. The talk has to be carefully rehearsed so that every nuance of the meaning is brought out. However, the talk must on no account be over dramatized because it would then cease to be a conversation and would sound unnatural. One of the important advantages which face to face communication gives the speaker is the feedback through the expressions on the face of the audience. If he sees them looking puzzled, he can explain the point further. If they look bored, he can move on the next point and so on. The talker and the on the radio has to manage without these important signals. The talker must therefore anticipate audience response when writing the script or when rehearsing it. If he finds anything lacking in clarity or talking too much time, he should find a corrective way for it. Next technique is target audience. The radio talk is usually enjoyed in retrospect. While it is on air, your attention is focused on what is going on. You dare not relax your attention for fear of missing a crucial link. It is only when it is over that you can think over what has been said, especially the main point, to grasp the significance of what has been said. But in order to do this, you must be able to remember it. The secret of writing effectively for the radio is right so as to be remembered. Radio writing must be memorable. Broadly speaking, there are two sets of factors which determine recall. They are subjective factors and objective factors, and a talk should be organized keeping these factors in mind. The subjective factors relate to the mental makeup of the person who has to remember, and the objective factors to the material which has to be remembered. So, now we will discuss interview, that is similar to talk but not very much similar because they are different formats of radio. So, a radio interview is a conversation or discussion conducted on a radio program between a host or interviewer and a guest. It is a format commonly used in radio broadcasting to engage listeners and provide insights or information on a specific topic or with a particular individual. So before moving ahead, we are discussing that what is interview. We will discuss it in detail. The aim of an interview is to provide in the interviews on words, facts, reasons, or opinions on a particular topic so that listener can form a conclusion as to the validity of what he or she is saying. It follows from his definition that the opinions of the interviewer are not to be counted here and that he should not get drawn into answering the question himself or herself. Within the present definition, it is the interviewee who must come through in the performance and not the interviewer. So, what are the types of interviews? Generally, there are three types of interviews: spot interviews, field interviews, and studio interviews. Spot interviews are brief and usually limited in scope. Who will you vote for? Are you happy with the new tax policies? As a passenger, how do you rate the service? Field interviews can be either long or brief. You may interview a farmer on his farm, a pilot at the airport, or sailor on the ship. The pilot can be asked about his training, his experience, and his psychological makeup to fly different modes of aircraft. The roaring sound of planes taking off or landing can be recorded, and this gives authenticity to the interview. Studio interviews are usually formal. Again, these may either be long or short. Attention has to be given to correctness and propriety while addressing the interviewee. For the sake of simplicity, three approaches to interviews can be identified, although any of one situation may involve all three categories to a greater or lesser extent. These are the informal, interpretative, and emotional interviews. Obviously, the function of the informational interview is to provide information to the listener. The sequence in which this is done becomes important if the details are to remain clear. This type of interview demands through preparation. There should be considerable research and discussion done about what should be included or excluded. Facts and statistics should be checked and cross checked. If, for instance, one plans to produce an interview on global warming, one must look thoroughly into the phenomena, causes, effects, and consequences of global warming. The objective here is to be informative and descriptive, not perspective or interpretative. Can you explain the phenomena of global warming? Can you tell the reasons that have brought about the phenomena? What are the effects and consequences of global warming? The interpretative interview has the interviewer supplying the facts and asking the interviewee to either comment on them and explain them. The aim is to bring into the open the reasoning of the interviewee and allow the listener to make a judgment on his or her sense of values or priorities. Replies to question will almost certainly contain statements as justification of a particular courses of action. They may themselves also be further questioned. An example of this kind of interviews would be, for instance, an education minister giving his reason for an already not asking for facts of the matter. These will be generally known. Rather, he is interviewing the interview's reactions to the fact. A good interviewer will always know what a situation of this kind is generally reactive and would therefore never rehearse in detail. The aim of the emotional interview to give an insight into the interviewee's mind so that the listener may understand what is involved in human terms. Specific examples would be feeling of the relative of, say, victim of the train accident, of the feeling of achievement for an athlete who has won an Olympic gold medal. In these situations, it is the strength of the feeling present and not rationality that is important. Needless to say, emotional interviews need sensitive handling. It is very easy to slip into the sensational when one is handling human emotion. An interviewer must consciously stop him or herself from exploiting vulnerable situation and intruding into private grief. So, How to prepare for the interview, or we can say before the interview. It is essential for the interviewer to know he or she seeks to achieve. Is it the objective of the interview to establish facts or discuss reasons? What are the main points that need to be covered? What are the established argument in this case? What runs counter to it? Is there anything else I need to know? If the interviewer is not the producer, if he so then he must have a thorough briefing with the producer and research team. Even if the interviewer is working with the research team, he or she should be absolutely thorough with the background material. There should be no confusion with the names, dates, figures, and facts. Even a minor error can sound embarrassing. For example, why did you choose to hold the conference in 1977? Well, actually, we held it in 1973. Or, as Chancellor of the University, how do you see the future? No, I am the chairman. At this point, it makes no difference of the validity of the question, but a lack of care undermines the questioner's credibility in the eyes of the interviewee. And more importantly, in the ears of the listener, once basic information is gathered, the interviewer should concentrate on structuring the questions. There is no ideal way of structuring the question, nor is there any need to have a rigid structure to follow. The next The next stage after the preparatory work is to discuss the interview with the interviewee. The first few minutes are crucial as it determines how the interview will proceed. The interviewer can never fully know how the interviewee will respond. He or she may be brisk and professional, sympathetic, friendly, inhibited, whatever. In an article titled Updating the Talking Head Technique, Walt Robson groups difficult interviews into three categories: the clam, sham, and ham. The clam claims Robson clams up with the sea water fish it's named after. In other words, the guest is so nervous that he or she gives one line answers and no more. The sham, on the other hand, is a Mr. Know All who actually doesn't know very much. The ham is even worse because he takes over and assumes control. Have you ever give have you ever seen a clam? Ham or sham? How did the interviewer handle the problem? Robson gives a few answers. The clam, if or he she's to open up, has to be put on the right foot. What interest provokes, inspires, bother him or her the most? Find that area and get him or her to talk. The sham is likely to get him herself into the corner by being overconfident. The interviewer has provided the sham an escape route. Of course, that depends on whether the interviewer wants to provide an escape route. If the purpose of the interviewer is to corner someone, then it is a different matter. Finally, we have the ham, who could be malicious, precocious, or simply hysterical. Whatever the event, he is out of control. It is most important for the interviewer at this point to remain absolutely cool, resist the temptation to hurl fatal verbs. The key to handling this difficult guest lies in the playing straight with sincerity and good humor. It is a common practice to say beforehand what the first question is going to be. This can help avoid a complete freeze once the tape starts recording. Specialist and technical jargon is always better avoided. Though the interviewee may be a specialist, the listeners are not. Short and articulate introduction are always preferable to long and rambling ones. Conclusions need careful handling. The last note is probably what the listeners will carry home. It may be useful to precede the last question with the signals to the interviewee about time running out. This could be indicated with the questions such as briefly, why, in a word, how, at the simplest, what. So, here's in an overview of the typical structure and elements of radio interview. First is introduction. The RJ introduces the interview, providing background information about the guest and the topic of the discussion. They may briefly highlight the guest expertise, achievements, or relevance to the subject matter. Opening questions. The host begins the interview by asking opening questions to set the context and establish a rapport with the guest. These questions are usually open ended and designed to encourage the guest to share their thoughts or insights. Main discussion. The host and guest engage in a conversation, exchanging ideas, opinions, and information related to the topic at hand. The host may ask a series of prepared questions or engage in more free flowing conversation, allowing the guest to expand on their responses and share their expertise. Probing and follow up questions. Throughout the interview, the host may ask probing questions to delve deeper into specific aspects of the discussion or seek clarification on certain points. Follow up questions help the host further explore the guest's insight and ensure a comprehensive understanding of the topic. Audience interaction. Depending upon the format of radio program, the host may incorporate audience interaction by taking calls, reading listeners' questions or comments, or engaging with the audience through social media. This allows listeners to participate in the conversation and contribute to the interview. So, here we conclude that as the interview near its end, the host may summarize key points discussed and provide a smooth transition to concluding remarks. They may express appreciation for the guest participation, highlight any upcoming events or projects relating to the guest, and invite listeners to stay tuned for future programming. So today we have discussed only three formats that are podcast, radio talk, and radio interview.